As you probably know, if you've been a long-time fan of this channel, there raged an intercommunal conflict in Northern Ireland for many years, commonly known as the Trolls. Lasting from the late 1960s until 1998, the conflict claimed the lives of more than 3,000 people. It was punctuated by bombing campaigns, sectarian violence, street riots, and kidnappings. What you perhaps don't know is the depths of depravity that emerged from this conflict and the vicious nature of some of the acts committed by the group's party to it. On the one hand, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, who were known for their bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, and vigilante justice meted out through punishments such as kneecapping, wherein an individual accused of a given crime would be shot in both knees as a deterrent to similar perpetrators. Among the many victims of the group were an unfortunate group of people known as the Disappeared, who were civilians often dubiously accused of collaboration of some kind who were kidnapped and murdered, with many of their bodies never being found to this day. However, what sometimes escapes the microscope are some of the other groups whose actions, even if smaller in body count, were no less despicable, committing acts so gruesome that it is as if the public has simply chosen to forget them. One such group is the Shankill Butchers, a gang of men belonging to the so-called Loyalist faction and who committed a series of killings in the 1970s at the height of the conflict. The group gained their name by kidnapping civilians at random in the dead of night and torturing them to death using utensils such as butcher's knives before dumping the bodies in plain view the next morning. The Shankill Butchers are often referred to as the worst serial killers in the history of the UK. Yet their brutal actions are largely lost amidst the horrors of the time, despite being undeniably responsible for one of the most inglorious episodes of murderous depravity in all of Europe. So today we thought we'd take a look at this group and shine a light on their crimes, which for some still live in infamy, despite the relatively brief existence of the group and the violent end for its leader, Lenny Murphy. The name of the gang was from their base of operations in the Shankill, a well-known street and neighbourhood in Belfast. The Shankill Road is a broad thoroughfare which runs through West Belfast, largely populated by supporters of the continued place of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, and which is seen as a bastion of the same ideology, which is known as unionism. The Shankill Road runs close to the mostly Irish Republican neighbourhood of the Falls Road and close to so-called flashpoint areas, thinly separating two communities traditionally in favour of either a united Ireland or continued British rule. The most well-known terror organisation, belonging to the Unionist cause, had its headquarters on the Shankill Road. This was the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, which traced its origins to a campaign to prevent Ireland from seceding from the British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. The UVF reformed in the mid-1960s, shortly before the Troubles began, and amidst the rise of a strain of unionism characterised by British nationalist fervour, which came to be referred to as Loyalism. The group became one of the key players in the conflict as it spiralled out of control in the following decade. Its actions featured gun and bombing campaigns overwhelmingly targeted at Catholic residents of Northern Ireland and occasionally at Irish communities living south of the border. This included a double bombing attack in Dublin and the northern county of Monaghan in 1974, which killed 35 people and injured almost 300. And although the UVF's sworn enemy was the Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA members constituted a minority of its victims, most of whom were instead Catholic civilians murdered at random, often in spree killings and attacks on bars and public houses. This was a practice in one way encapsulated by the longtime leader of the organisation, Augustus "Gusty" Spence, who declared in 1966, "If you can't get an IRA man, get a tag instead," with tag being a common slur used against Catholics in Northern Ireland. However, perhaps the most grotesque of all these murders were killings committed in the 1970s by an offshoot gang composed largely of UVF members, a band of men whose sole and only purpose was to identify individuals they presumed to be Irish Catholics and to murder them. This group was the Shankill Butchers. Writer Conor Cruiser-Bryan, in his foreword to Martin Dillon's landmark book, The Shankill Butchers, noted that amidst all the devastation of the Troubles, the Shankill Butchers stood apart. Even the Provisional IRA, for all their brutal crimes, never committed the kind of vile acts which the Butchers did. The modus operandi of the Shankill Butchers was quite simple. Members of the group would lie in wait at night in areas of North Belfast, waiting for male passers-by to walk past as they returned to their homes, often from nights out. They would then set upon their chosen victim, bundling into a car and driving off before killing them. The intended victims of these murders were Catholics, seen with such a visceral hatred by many members of the gang and wider loyalist paramilitary organisations. The sites of the kidnappings were therefore streets which led towards predominantly Catholic neighbourhoods, under the assumption that anyone returning there at night was likely a Catholic themselves and therefore suitable for abduction. Of course, their selection of victims was about as sophisticated as the way in which those victims were then brutally murdered. It resulted that some of their victims were not Catholics at all, and several Protestants were subject to the barbarism of the group. Unfortunately, the group didn't seem to feel that they could apologize and let the captives go, and so the Protestant victims of the Butchers met the same fate as the Catholics. The gang continued their murderous campaign for several years, beginning with the quadruple murder of the staff of a liquor store in 1975 and ending in 1977 after most of the gang were rounded up and ultimately jailed. With that said, some members of the gang also committed individual murders either side of this time period. In that 2-year period, 19 met their fates at the hands of the Butchers, generally by having their throats slit, their wrists cut, or being bludgeoned to death in the shaded confines of areas nearby the Shankill Road. The identities of the perpetrators were a mystery to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, or PSNI, who tried in vain for several years to gain information on their identities from residents in the area. Their efforts were always rebuffed and met with a strict wall of silence. With that said, it is not to say that the Butchers' identities were not suspected, if not known, by some residents of the Shankill. As attested to by multiple community figures and some investigators subsequently, the names of at least some of the perpetrators of the most demented behavior of the Troubles were common knowledge, but information was not shared with the authorities for fear of subsequent retribution by members or allies of the group. This resulted in the spree continuing for the length of the time it did. Part of the reason for this silence was the sheer viciousness of which members of the group were capable, and which could be turned on to members of their own community at a moment's notice. And so the perpetrators of the murders continued living among their neighbours in North Belfast, despite the depravity of the murders and their responsibility being as well known as their reputations were feared. The ringleader of the Shankill Butchers was a criminal and UVF member by the name of Lenny Murphy. Murphy was a native of the Shankill Road. According to author Martin Dillon, in his youth he was often confused for a Catholic due to his surname being common among Irish Catholics in Belfast and one of the most common family names in the Republic of Ireland. In primary school, he was nicknamed Murphy the Mick and other slur for Irish people and developed a visceral hatred of all Catholics, regularly describing them through the use of slurs and displaying a sectarian hatred unique even among other loyalist figures. Murphy was a petty thief and criminal from an early age and displayed sociopathic tendencies. He also regularly attended trials at Belfast's Crumlin Road Courthouse, building an awareness of legal processes which would allow him to evade the law when he began his crimes in subsequent years. Having already joined the UVF and another loyalist paramilitary organisation, the Ulster Defence Association, Murphy formed the Shankill Butchers and began their murder spree in 1975. His first killings, however, took place in the summer of 1972, when several Catholic men were abducted one by one and taken to the Lawnbrook Social Club, a bar on the Shankill Road. There they were beaten and stabbed with knives for hours by a group of men, sometimes in front of willing or unwilling onlookers. A 20-year-old Lenny Murphy was front and center among their tormentors, inflicting the most vicious injuries to the victims and often the fatal blow. That same year, Murphy was accused of the murder of a Protestant man, Edward Parvis. Parvis, a keen hunter, had been accused of arms dealing, and during his trial it was revealed that one of his customers and hunting companions was a Roman Catholic priest. This was considered fraternizing with the enemy, and while Parvis was on patrol, Murphy arrived at his home and shot him dead. Murphy was, however, accused of the murder by his accomplice and getaway driver, Mervyn Connor. Inexplicably, however, the two were kept on the same prison ward at the Crumlin Road prison, and Connor was shortly found dead of cyanide poisoning, with a suicide note exonerating Murphy nearby. Another prisoner on the ward mentioned having seen Murphy enter the ward and force a pill into Connor's mouth while prison guards were on a break. That prisoner, shortly afterwards, was beaten to death. Resultantly, the murder case fell apart and Murphy was soon back on the streets. He formed the Shankill Butchers shortly after, and the crime spree began. In 1976, with the murders ongoing, Murphy was arrested when he returned to the scene of one of his murders to retrieve a handgun that he had left there. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, beginning his term in 1977. All told, Murphy only served 6 years in prison before he was released. His crimes were, nonetheless, put to an abrupt end shortly after. Despite this, it is estimated that he murdered as many as 13 people in his life, including several during the brief period between his release from prison and his death. Yet Murphy was never actually charged with any of these murders. But Murphy quickly returned to murdering. He is thought to have murdered 4 more innocent people in the time after his release, including one man, a mentally diminished individual, who wandered into the bar where Murphy was celebrating his release. The man died after having been beaten and run over several times by Murphy in his car. A few weeks later, he abducted another man who he tortured by pulling out his teeth with pliers. The victim was unrecognizable by the time his body was found. But Murphy was very far from the only adherent to the worst depravity of the Butchers. Other key figures included his older brother John, suspected by some to be the true leader of the organization, as well as other members such as Sam McAllister, Robert the Basher Bates, and William Moore. Moore, in particular, was central to the operation of the gang. He was a taxi driver, and it was his black taxicab which was often used to abduct and murder the group's targets as they walked home late at night. Moore had also worked in a meatpacking plant and therefore had access to butcher's knives, which were later used to carry out the killings. It was, moreover, he who became the leader of the gang when Lenny Murphy was sentenced to prison, and under his leadership, the killings continued with as much vigor as before. All told, there were around 20 members of the gang, most of them men in their early 20s and petty criminals, with the oldest member of the gang being 31 when the group formed. It's likely that some of the participants in the gang's activities were never identified and therefore never paid the price for their actions, despite the brutality that they participated in. In total, the Shankill Butchers murdered at least 23 people. Of these, 15 were Catholics and 8 were Protestants. 3 victims were members of loyalist paramilitary organizations killed by members of the Butchers in disputes. The remainder were all civilians, with none having well-defined links to terrorist factions. None of the dead were members of the IRA. The way in which individuals met their ends at the hands of the Shankill Butchers were varied, but all resulted in a carnival of violence. The first individual victim, Francis McCrossan, was killed by having his throat slashed. Several other victims were also killed by having their throats hacked by Murphy, Moore, or others with a knife. In 1977, Cornelius Neeson died after having been attacked in the streets by Moore with a hatchet, ultimately bleeding to death. His death occurred the same evening that the Butchers attacked a bar in Belfast city centre and massacred 4 patrons and the bar owner, who was shot in the chest from close range by Robert Basher Bates. Bates later revealed that his compensation for the killing was a 1-litre bottle of vodka. The Shankill Butchers were neither particularly inventive or efficient with their killing patterns. The victims, almost all of them innocent civilians, were chosen at random and often clumsily hacked at with knives by their captors, suffering agonizing deaths in the process. The members of the gang were an undisciplined group of men, many of them part-time employed heavy drinkers and who often got into deadly feuds with members of other loyalist paramilitary groups. The killings continued with several more random attacks in 1977. This included 2 more throat slashings and a bomb attack on an Easter Republican parade, which killed a 7-year-old boy. But one individual the group did not succeed in murdering was Gerald McLaverty, another innocent Belfast man who'd been abducted while walking home. Although he was beaten, stabbed, and ultimately left for dead in a back alley with slashed wrists, he survived and would ultimately prove the gang's undoing. A few days later, McLaverty was able to assist the police in identifying members of the group who'd assailed him. After a quick escort around the Shankill Road, he identified several, including Basher Bates, who, perhaps unsurprisingly, lingered in plain sight. Before long, several members had been arrested. By the late 70s, the murder spree of the Shankill Butchers was brought to an end. 11 members were prosecuted and would be hauled into court to face their murder charges. The case was successful in the prosecution of the arrested men, assisted by the positive identification of McLaverty and the fact that William Moore crumbled under police interrogation, confessing to the crimes and identifying other participants. 42 life sentences were doled out to the members of the group in February 1979. Jointly, the sentences handed down to the 11 convicted men amounted to more than 2,000 years in prison. In his landmark book, The Shankill Butchers, published in 1989 as the Troubles raged on, journalist Martin Dillon made the point that the PSNI, under Chief Inspector Jimmy Nesbitt, managed to identify and convict the worst gang of serial murderers in the entire history of the UK, despite having only 11 detectives working the case. This paled significantly when compared to the 304 police officers working to track down the Yorkshire Ripper, a serial killer active in northern England at around the same time. The murders also occurred amidst the height of the Troubles, at a time when murders were taking place regularly all across Northern Ireland. Undoubtedly, it was a huge accomplishment. However, questions have been asked about the level of preparedness of the police to prevent the actions of the group as they took place, as well as the level of knowledge of the loyalist community of the men responsible, which could have prevented at least some of the deaths from taking place. Unlike other serial killers in the UK at the time, the Butchers had made no effort to hide the bodies of their victims or mask the aims of their behaviour. They operated in a compact area of Belfast, which, although densely populated, was still no bigger than 15 square miles in size. Several of them were known to police as members of the UVF, and some were even questioned regarding their knowledge of some of the murders. Yet none were charged until the failed attack on McLaverty. One of the most significant questions is how Mervyn Connor, accuser of Lenny Murphy for the murder of Edward Parvis, could possibly have been allowed to share a prison ward with the man he accused. Arguably, had the detention of Murphy and Connor been handled with greater care, the activities of the Butchers would have been prevented. Moreover, given the fate of Connor, it may have even prohibited the coming forward of other members of the Shankill community, lest they too suffer the same fate as him. Some journalists have even claimed that the police were aware of the identities of the Butchers alongside members of the civilian community. A 2011 documentary by Northern Irish journalist Stephen Nolan shed new light on the details behind the gang's actions and downfall. In it, Nolan expressed dubiousness that the members of the community of the Shankill, or at the very least other figures of the Loyalist paramilitary movement, were unaware of the identities of the members of the group. Journalist Jim Campbell, himself the survivor of an assassination attempt by the UVF in the 1980s, lent further weight to this belief. In an interview with Nolan, he noted that if state security forces had the capacity to infiltrate the tight hierarchical structure of the Irish Provisional Army, then it was almost inconceivable that they were hamstrung by a street gang like the Shankill Butchers for several years. In concluding, Nolan noted that the Shankill Butchers were arguably even worse than the other notorious serial killer active at the time, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. When finally caught, Sutcliffe claimed voices in his head had encouraged him to commit the murders of 13 women. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But the Shankill Butchers had heard no such voices in their heads, none other than the deafening sound of their own hatred. Despite the heavy sentences meted out to the Shankill Butchers, all convicted members walked free in 1998 under terms of the Good Friday Agreement. The agreement was a multilateral treaty signed by most of Northern Ireland's political parties and the British and Irish governments, and which saw a ceasefire and the eventual decommissioning of weapons held by paramilitary groups. It saw the conditional release of 483 prisoners belonging to those organizations on license, with the stipulation that their freedom would be revoked if they returned to violence. Amongst those who walked free were some of the worst perpetrators of the 30-year period of violence in Northern Ireland. However, that is not to say that no justice of any kind was dealt out to the members of the group for their heinous acts. In 1982, Lenny Murphy was released from his trifling firearms conviction and sent out once again into the public. It's thought that during this time he killed a further 3 Catholic civilians, continuing the unimaginative barbarism which the group had used to terrorize civilian communities the previous decade. However, members of Murphy's own paramilitary community quickly tired of his uncontrollable brutality, and details of his movements were passed on to the Provisional IRA, who paid Murphy a visit in November 1982. He was shot 30 times. Lenny Murphy died, never having been charged for any of the 13 murders which he is suspected of having committed. He was buried at Carmody Cemetery, the same cemetery in which one of his Catholic victims was buried after a UVF funeral. His headstone bore the inscription, "Here lies a soldier," the title of a popular unionist song, although Murphy never served in the military or even killed anyone who was in a realistic position to fight back. Despite all their victims, nobody from the Shankill Butchers is known to have targeted even a single confirmed member of a Republican paramilitary group, despite these being their declared arch-enemies. The older Murphy brother, John, also didn't outlive the troubles. He died in a car accident in Northern Ireland in 1998, only 1 month before the Good Friday Agreement took effect. Basher Bates didn't fare much better. After his release, he was swiftly murdered by the son of a Loyalist paramilitary member, whom Bates had himself murdered in 1977, shortly before his arrest. Bates's funeral was attended by hundreds, and his name was included on the banner of a branch of the Orange Order, a Protestant fraternal organization called the Old Boyne Island Heroes. As revealed in the 2011 documentary, Charlotte Morrissey, daughter of the group's 10th victim, Joseph Morrissey, had the misfortune of blundering into view of the Bates funeral procession. Joseph Morrissey had been hacked to death and his body mutilated in 1977, but his daughter could do little other than sit and watch as huge wreaths were paraded through the streets, glorifying one of the members of the group responsible for her father's death. Unfortunately, many of the other key members of the gang, including William Moore, lived the rest of their lives in relative normality. The same was true of many members of the IRA and other terrorist organizations operating in Northern Ireland, some of whom have since sought repentance for their crimes, many of whom haven't, and some of whom even continued upon the path of sectarian violence in the years after the signing of the agreement. Martin Dillon stated that there were up to 17 people involved with the murders who were never brought to justice, and many of these were never identified. But even many of the known members of the gang were able to see out their lives without even having spent the majority of their sentences in prison for the crimes they committed. William Moore, noteworthy for both having taken over the leadership of the group when Murphy was in prison and for mutilating victims' bodies after they were dead, died of a heart attack in 2009, having recently come under investigation for yet another murder committed in 1974. Sam McAllister, another member of the group known for his large size and being able to physically drag victims into waiting cars, and who was instrumental in the failed murder of Jared McLaverty, which led to the group's downfall, was also released and continues to live in relative normality, though he was wounded in an assassination attempt in 2001 following yet another Loyalist feud. He was also shot in both arms as punishment for beating another Loyalist to death with a breeze block in 1976. One of the lesser-known members of the gang, Eddie McIlwain, still alive and also a member of the Orange Order, even participated in one of the group's annual 12th of July parades in 2023, commemorating the victory of a Protestant king over a Catholic king at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. McIlwain was also a former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, an infantry division of the British Army active in Northern Ireland, and was dismissed from his position around the time of the Butchers' arrest. A few days before the parade in 2023, he had been pictured erecting a UVF flag on the Shankill Road. When questioned, McIlwain claimed that he had, quote, paid his debt to society. He'd served a total of 8 years in prison.